She was a night shift cleaner. He was the most feared shadow boss in Las Vegas. She was caught after witnessing something she never should have seen, and she was given an offer no mother would ever dare refuse. This is the story of a woman who stepped into the darkness to save her child and found light in the last place she ever expected. The clock on the wall showed 2 o'clock in the morning when Leah Sinclair pushed her cleaning cart through the VIP corridor of the Meridian casino. Her brown hair was tied up neatly, though a few loose strands clung to her sweat-damp forehead. Her amber eyes carried the weariness of someone who'd stayed awake through far too many nights, and her hands, roughened by labor, gripped the broom handle as though it were the only thing keeping her on her feet. She was 27 years old, yet life had already carved across her shoulders the burden of a woman of 40. Tonight, the night manager had assigned her to clean the restricted area because they were short-staffed. An area employees like her were never allowed to enter. But she needed the money, Mila needed surgery, and Leah wasn't in any position to refuse anything. The VIP hallway was so silent it felt terrifying. Dim light cast long shadows across the red velvet walls, and every step Leah took echoed like a drumbeat in the stillness. She pushed her cart past each room, cleaning quickly, trying to finish before dawn. But when she reached the end of the hallway, she realized she'd taken a wrong turn. In front of her stood a heavy oak door, slightly ajar, and from inside came tense voices. Instinct told her to walk away, but her feet seemed nailed to the floor when her eyes accidentally passed over the narrow opening and caught sight of what was happening inside. 3 unfamiliar men stood facing someone seated in the shadows. Their voices were full of threat, and words like dividing territory, pipeline, and payment drifted through the air. Leah held her breath. She knew she wasn't supposed to be here. She knew she had to leave immediately. But before she could even turn around, the door flew open and a hand like a steel clamp seized the collar of her shirt and yanked her into the room. Leah fell to the floor, her knees striking the carpet with a dry, jarring sound. When she looked up, her heart skipped a beat. The man in front of her was over 6 feet tall, with neatly cropped black hair and cold gray eyes like steel that seemed to pierce straight through her. A faint scar ran along the left side of his jaw, the mark of a past she had no desire to know anything about. His tailored black suit fit close against his balanced, powerful frame, and the way he sat there, calm as though nothing at all had just happened, made her understand at once exactly who she was facing. Ashton Mercer, the shadow boss of Las Vegas, the man whose name the entire city whispered in fear. Ashton didn't shout. He didn't threaten her. He only looked at her with those eyes and asked in a low, even voice so chilling it made her skin tighten. What had she heard? Leah trembled, but she didn't cry. She'd cried enough in this life already. She looked straight into those eyes and answered, "I didn't hear anything. I just got lost, and I only want to go home to my daughter." Ashton didn't react. He simply gestured to the man who dragged her into the room. Reed Galloway, Ashton Mercer's right hand for 20 years. Reed pulled out his phone, typed quickly, and within minutes, every detail of Leah Sinclair's life appeared on the screen. Widow. Husband was a police officer, murdered while investigating a money laundering ring 4 years earlier. 1 6-year-old daughter, Mila Sinclair, born with a congenital heart condition. Cost of surgery, $800,000. Currently working 2 jobs, no criminal record, no ties to any organization. Ashton listened in silence. Then he looked at Leah for a long time, as though he were reading every page of her soul. At last, he spoke in a voice stripped of all emotion. "You can go." Leah couldn't believe what she'd heard. She rose to her feet, her legs still trembling, and walked straight toward the door. She didn't look back. She didn't say thank you. She didn't beg. She simply walked, one step at a time, until the door closed behind her and the hallway fell quiet again. That night, Leah went home and held Mila as they slept, never knowing those eyes had already remembered her name, never knowing her life would never be the same again. 3 days later, as Leah was getting ready for work, the manager called her up to the office. Not the usual office, the penthouse floor at the very top of the Meridian building, a place no employee had ever been invited to. Leah's heart pounded against her ribs as she stepped into the elevator. She thought she was going to be killed. She thought they'd make her disappear and no one would ever find her body. But when the elevator doors opened and she saw Ashton Mercer standing beside a wall of glass overlooking the glittering sweep of Las Vegas, she understood that what was waiting for her was even more insane than death. Because Ashton Mercer wasn't planning to kill her, He was planning to buy her. If this story touched your heart, please press like to support us. Don't forget to share it with the people you love, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next deeply emotional chapters. The penthouse was vast enough to feel like another world. The white marble floor reflected the soft, golden light. Expensive, abstract paintings hung upon the walls, and an enormous glass wall opened onto the glittering sweep of Las Vegas below, like a boundless carpet of light unfurling into the distance. Leah stood in the middle of the room, feeling small and out of place, like a blot of ink spilled across a sheet of white paper. Ashton Mercer stood beside the glass wall with his back to her, his hands clasped behind him. He didn't turn when she entered, as though she were nothing more than another piece of darkness slipping across the threshold. The silence stretched until it became suffocating. Leah clenched her hands, her nails biting into her palms, trying to keep her voice from trembling when she finally chose to break the stillness. "Why did you call me here?" Ashton still didn't turn. His voice rose low and steady, like pebbles rolling across the surface of a still lake. "Your daughter. How much does that surgery cost?" Leah blinked, not understanding why he would ask such a thing, but she answered anyway, because she had nothing to hide. 800,000. Money I don't have and never will." At last, Ashton turned around, and when the light fell across his face, Leah noticed something that startled her. His eyes were no longer as cold as they had been the night before. They were tired down to the bone, as though the man who carried them had been fighting something invisible for years and was now beginning to lose. "I have that money." He said it without hesitation. Leah felt as though the ground beneath her feet had tilted. "What do you want from me?" Ashton walked toward the large oak table in the center of the room, poured a glass of water, and placed it in front of her. Then he sat down in the chair across from her, as though they were about to discuss an ordinary business arrangement. "I'm dying." He said it plainly, without circling around the truth. "End-stage bone marrow cancer. The doctors have given me 8 to 10 months, maybe less." Leah said nothing. She only looked at him, trying to absorb what she had just heard. The man sitting in front of her, the most powerful shadow boss in Las Vegas, was dying. Ashton continued, his voice still even, as though he were reading from a financial report. "I don't have a wife. I don't have children. If I die without a legal heir, everything I've built will fall into the hands of my younger brother, Preston." He paused, and his eyes darkened slightly. "Preston has secretly made a deal with the Castellano family, my biggest rivals. The moment I close my eyes, he'll sell everything out. 200 people who work for me will lose their jobs. The families I've protected will be swallowed whole. Everything I've spent my life building will turn to ash." Leah listened, her heart beating faster with every word. She was beginning to understand what he wanted, but she still couldn't quite bring herself to believe it. Ashton looked straight into her eyes without looking away. "I need you to marry me. I need you to give me an heir. In return, I'll pay the full cost of your daughter's surgery immediately. Not after the wedding. Right now. And when I die, you'll inherit half of everything I own. The other half will belong to the child." Leah felt as though someone had just driven a fist into her stomach. She sprang to her feet, and the chair scraped backward with a harsh, piercing sound. "You're insane." Her voice shook, but it was still full of fury. "You think I'll sell myself to the Mafia? What kind of woman do you think I am?" Ashton didn't get angry. He only looked at her with those tired eyes and answered in a voice so soft it surprised her. "I think you're the kind of woman who'd do anything to save her daughter. Because if I were in your place, I'd do the same." Leah stood there, breathing hard, her hands curled into fists. She wanted to scream in his face. She wanted to run from this room and never come back. But Mila's face rose in her mind, those tiny lips tinged purple in the grip of heart pain, the beeping sound of the heart monitor in the emergency room, the doctor's voice saying that if she didn't have the surgery within 2 months, she wouldn't survive. Ashton stood up and walked toward the window, giving her his back once again. "I'll give you 1 week to think. Whatever you decide, I'll respect it. But there's one thing I want you to know." He paused, and his voice dropped lower. "I'm not looking for someone to love me. I'm looking for someone I can trust. And that night, when you looked into my eyes without fear, without begging, and only said that you wanted to go home to your daughter, I knew you were the one I needed." Leah didn't answer. She turned and walked out of the penthouse, each step heavy as stone. When the elevator doors closed and she was alone inside that narrow space, her mind spun like a storm. She had just been offered the chance to sell her soul to the devil in order to save her little angel. And the most frightening part wasn't the offer itself. The most frightening part was that she was truly considering it. On the first day, Leah couldn't sleep. She lay on the old bed in her cramped apartment, staring up at a ceiling stained with spreading patches of damp, and felt her anger rising in her chest like a living flame. James. She thought of her husband, the man who had died 4 years earlier while investigating a money laundering ring that led into the underworld. She remembered the night the police knocked on her door, remembered the way their eyes avoided hers when they told her James was gone, remembered how she had collapsed to the floor and cried out in agony while she was 3 months pregnant with Mila. James had died because of that world, and now she was considering stepping into the very world that had killed him. She felt as though she were betraying the man she had loved, betraying the 4 years she had spent preserving his memory, betraying every promise she whispered each night to the wedding photograph, resting by her bedside. On the second day, the anger began to cool, and reason slowly started to take over. Leah sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold in front of her, and she analyzed the situation with the kind of cold clarity James had once taught her. Ashton Mercer wasn't forcing her. He had made a clear offer and given her 1 week to think. That wasn't the behavior of a man taking something by force. She opened her old laptop and spent the entire afternoon searching for information about him. What she found surprised her. Ashton Mercer owned the 5 largest casinos in Las Vegas and controlled a real estate empire worth billions of dollars. Yet there was no news of him ever harming innocent people. Ruthless with his enemies, that was how the underground articles described him, but absolutely loyal to his own people. 200 families depended on the empire he had built, and he was dying. Leah closed the laptop, her thoughts tangled into a knot she couldn't undo. The third day turned into a nightmare. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Leah was awakened by the faint sound of Mila crying from the next room. She ran in, and her heart nearly stopped when she saw her daughter. Mila lay in bed, her lips tinted blue, her chest rising and falling in painful struggle, as though every breath were a fight for her life. "Mommy, I can't breathe." Her little voice was so weak that Leah had to bend close to hear it. She gathered her into her arms, rushed down the stairs, out into the street, and flagged down a taxi with trembling hands. The entire way to the hospital, all she could do was hold Mila tightly and whisper prayers she didn't even know she still remembered. "You're going to be all right. Mommy promises you're going to be all right. Dear God, please let her be all right." 4 hours in the emergency waiting room became the longest 4 hours of Leah's life. She sat in a cold plastic chair, staring at the doors to the emergency room, every passing minute stretching out like a century. When the doctor finally came out, the gravity on his face was so severe that Leah had to grip the arms of her chair to keep from falling. "Your daughter is out of immediate danger," the doctor said, and Leah let out a breath as though she herself had just been spared. But the next word sent her plunging into the abyss all over again. "Her condition is very serious. If she doesn't have surgery within the next 2 months, her heart won't be able to hold on. I'm truly sorry, but we need you to prepare yourself for every possibility." Leah stood there feeling as though someone had torn all the air from her lungs. Every possibility. She understood exactly what the doctor meant. He was telling her to prepare herself to lose her daughter. On the 4th day, Leah went to the cemetery. She stood before James's grave for a long time, looking at the headstone carved with his name and the words, husband, father, hero. Mila hadn't come with her because she was still too weak, resting at home under the care of a kind neighbor. Leah sat down on the dew-soaked grass, not caring that the knees of her pants were getting wet, and began to speak to the man who was gone. "Would you hate me, James?" Her voice was hoarse from crying through too many nights. "If I do this, will you still look at me the way you used to? Or will you turn your back on me and never forgive me?" The wind moved through the cemetery, carrying the scent of wet grass and damp earth. There was no answer. But in that silence, Leah suddenly remembered the night before James died. He had held her and said, "If anything ever happens to me, you have to promise you'll protect our child at any cost. At any cost, no matter what that means." Leah rose to her feet, wiped away her tears, and for the first time in 4 days, she knew what she had to do. On the 5th day, she sat beside Mila's bed as her daughter slept. The little girl was still weak, her skin pale, but her breathing had become steadier. Leah looked at her daughter's tiny face, those long curved lashes, those soft pink lips, and she knew she would do anything to keep that child in this world. She took out a sheet of paper and began to write. Conditions, demands, boundaries, She would never allow anyone to cross. If she had to walk into hell, she would walk in with her eyes wide open and with rules of her own. On the 6th day, Leah stood once again before the penthouse door. In her hand was the sheet of paper with 6 conditions written in clear, careful handwriting. She drew in a deep breath and stepped inside. The decision had been made. Not because she wanted to, but because she was a mother. And any mother would be willing to walk into hell if that was the only way to save her child. Leah walked into the penthouse with a bearing entirely different from the last time. There was no trembling now, no panicked look in her eyes like prey driven into a corner. She walked with her back straight and her head held high, the sheet of paper clenched in her hand like a protective charm. Ashton was seated behind the oak desk, his eyes watching her approach with a curiosity he didn't bother to hide. She didn't wait for him to speak. She walked straight to the desk and placed the paper down in front of him, with one crisp, deliberate motion. Ashton looked down at the paper, then up at her, one corner of his mouth lifting slightly as though he were trying to hold back a smile. "Your conditions." His voice wasn't a question, but a quiet acknowledgement. Leah nodded and said nothing, waiting. Ashton picked up the paper and began to read, his eyes moving over each line with complete concentration. The first condition was that Mila's surgery had to be performed within 2 weeks, before any wedding took place, and the money had to be transferred directly to the hospital, never through Leah's hands. The second condition was that Mila could never know where the money had come from. To the child, it had to be the insurance money her father had left behind. The third condition was that Leah would retain full authority in raising Mila, and no one would be permitted to interfere with any decision she made concerning her daughter. The fourth condition was that she would take no part in any illegal activity. No killing, no money laundering, no false testimony, no touching anything that could send her to prison and leave Mila without a mother. The fifth condition was that she had the right to learn self-defense, because if she was going to live in his world, she needed to know how to protect herself and her daughter. The sixth condition was that after Ashton died, she would have the full right to leave the underworld if she chose, and no one would be allowed to stop her. When Ashton finished reading, he set the paper back down on the desk and lifted his eyes to hers with an expression Leah couldn't read. Silence lingered for a few seconds before he spoke. "Anything else?" Leah blinked, unable to believe what she'd heard. She had braced herself for a difficult negotiation, for him to cross out one condition after another. "You agree to all of it." Her voice carried the doubt she didn't bother to hide. Ashton rose from his chair, walked around the desk, and stopped a few steps away from her. "Everything you've asked for is reasonable." His voice was as calm as if they were discussing the weather. "You're a mother, and you're protecting your child. You didn't ask for money. You didn't ask for power. You didn't ask for meaningless luxuries. You only wanted to make sure your daughter would be safe, and that you wouldn't be turned into a puppet in my world." He paused, his eyes fixed steadily on hers. "I'm not looking for a servant. I'm looking for a partner, and what you've just given me tells me that you understand exactly what you're stepping into." Leah felt her heart beat one time faster. She drew in a deep breath and asked the question that had haunted her for 6 days. "Why me? You could choose anyone. Wealthy women, beautiful women, educated women, women with status. Why choose a cleaning woman who has nothing in her hands except a sick child and a mountain of debt?" Ashton fell silent for a moment, as though weighing how to say it in the truest way possible. When he finally spoke, his voice was slow and clear. "That night, when Reed dragged you into the room, I watched you very carefully. You didn't cry. You didn't beg. You didn't tremble and plead for your life. You looked straight into my eyes and said you wanted to go home to your daughter. Nothing more. Nothing less." He stepped one pace closer, and now only an arm's length remained between them. "I've met hundreds of people over the past 10 years. Every one of them was either afraid or greedy when they stood in front of me. Afraid because they knew who I was. Greedy because they wanted something from me. But you looked at me the way you'd look at an ordinary man standing in the way of your return to your child. You're the only person in 10 years who has looked into my eyes without fear or greed, and that's why I chose you." Leah didn't know how to answer. She stood there with the strange feeling that someone had seen all the way through her. At last she spoke, her voice slow but resolute. "I agree to this arrangement, but there's something you need to know. I don't love you, and I probably never will. Can you accept that?" Ashton didn't look hurt or disappointed. He only gave the slightest nod, as though her answer had been expected from the beginning. "I'm not asking for love. Love is a luxury neither of us has time for. What I am asking for is honesty. And up to this moment, you're the most honest person I've ever met." He held out his hand, a simple gesture, yet one that carried the weight of 1,000 promises left unspoken. "Do we have an agreement?" Leah looked at his hand, then lifted her gaze to those weary gray eyes. She thought of Mila lying in a hospital bed. She thought of James and the promise to protect their child at any cost. She thought of the hell she was about to enter. Then she placed her hand in his and held on tightly. They shook hands not like bride and groom, but like two people signing a contract. Two people stepping into an arrangement whose price they both understood. But neither of them knew where that cold and carefully drawn agreement would lead them. 2 weeks after they shook hands, Leah stood in a meeting room inside a 5-star hotel, preparing to marry a man she barely knew beyond the fact that he was dying and owned half of Las Vegas. The room felt strangely bare for a wedding. No fresh flowers, no music drifting softly in the background, no guests tossing petals and crying with joy. There were only 4 cream-colored walls, a long wooden table, a few chairs, and the cold faces of those gathered to witness it. The judge was an elderly man with silver hair and thick reading glasses. Ashton's lawyer sat in the corner with a towering stack of documents. Reed Galloway stood by the door like a guard carved from stone, and Ivana Chen, the housekeeper from the estate, was keeping Mila in the next room. Leah looked down at the white dress she was wearing. She had bought it from a discount store for $89, money she had saved over the course of 2 months from tips. The dress was a little loose at the waist and a little short at the hem, but it was all she could afford. She didn't have time to be ashamed of that. Ashton stood across from her, dressed as always in a perfectly tailored black suit, his dark hair neatly combed, his eyes resting on her with an expression she couldn't read. There was no boutonniere, no special tie, no sign of any kind that this was supposed to be the most important day in a man's life. The judge began to recite the familiar words every couple hears on their wedding day. Marriage is a sacred union between 2 souls. Love is the firm foundation of every family. Commitment and sacrifice are the keys to happiness. Leah listened, and every word struck her like a bitter reminder that this wedding held none of those things. No love, no sacredness, only an arrangement between a desperate mother and a dying man. "Do you agree to take this man as your husband?" the judge asked in a flat voice, as though he had spoken that sentence thousands of times and no longer cared what the answer might be. Leah turned to look at Ashton. He didn't smile. He didn't nod to encourage her. He made no gesture to push her forward. He simply stood there and waited, his eyes resting on her with a quiet respect, as though whatever she chose to say, he would accept it. Leah drew in a deep breath. She thought of Mila waiting in the next room. She thought of the surgery that had been scheduled for the following week. She thought of everything she had sacrificed to arrive at this moment. "I do." Her voice rang out clear and steady in the still room. There was no kiss after the pronouncement. No embrace. No tears of joy. There were only 2 signatures on a marriage certificate, and one brief handshake between 2 people who had just officially become husband and wife. As everyone began gathering up the papers, Ashton stepped closer to Leah and took a small box from the pocket of his suit jacket. Inside was a simple ring, white gold with a small sparkling stone. "You don't have to wear it if you don't want to." His voice was gentler than she had expected. "But in my world, people will ask questions. The ring will save you from the ones you don't need." Leah looked at the ring, then at him. She took it and slipped it onto the ring finger of her left hand. Not because of love, but because it was the practical thing to do. The door to the next room flew open, and Mila came running in like a little gust of wind, her brown hair flying loose, her eyes so much like her mother's shining brightly when she saw Leah. "Mommy, you look so pretty," the little girl cried, rushing forward to wrap her arms around Leah's legs. Leah bent down and gathered her daughter into her arms, hiding the faint shimmer of tears in her eyes. Then Mila looked up, her curious gaze shifting toward Ashton, who was standing nearby. "Who are you?" Her clear little voice sounded through the quiet room. Ashton looked at the child for a long moment, then slowly lowered himself until he was at eye level with her. "I'm your mother's friend." His voice was softer than Leah had ever heard it. Mila tilted her head, thinking for a moment, then nodded and accepted that simple answer with the trust only children possess. As she walked out of the hotel, her hand clasped tightly around Mila's, the newly placed ring cool against her finger, Leah wondered whether she had just stepped into hell or heaven, or perhaps she had stepped into both at once. The black limousine came to a stop before the enormous iron gates of the Beverly Hills estate, and Leah felt as though she had just stepped into another world. The mansion stretched out before her like a small palace, with ivory white walls, deep red roof tiles, and lush green gardens wrapped around it like a living painting. Her old apartment with Mila had only 2 small rooms, while this estate was likely 50 times larger, large enough to swallow the entire housing block where she had once lived. Mila was the first to leap out of the car, her eyes wide as 2 shining marbles. She froze for 1 second, then began running everywhere, her delighted cries ringing out like the song of a lark. "Mommy, there's a swimming pool." "It's so big, Mommy. And there's a garden, too, with flowers in every color." "Mommy, look, this house is so huge." Her clear little voice filled the garden, and Leah stood there watching her daughter run and spin with a heart that felt both lighter and painfully tight. Mila didn't know the price her mother had paid for her to stand here. Mila didn't know how heavy the ring on her mother's hand truly was, and Leah prayed her daughter would never have to know. During the first days in the estate, Leah lived in a state of constant tension. She imagined cold-faced men walking through the halls with weapons on them, secret meetings behind closed doors, shouting voices, and an atmosphere of danger hanging over everything. But the reality was entirely different. Ashton was almost never home. He left early in the morning and came back when the night was already deep, and sometimes he didn't come home for days at all. When he was home, he stayed in his study or spoke on the phone, never once invading her space. Their bedrooms were at opposite ends of the hallway, separated by a distance Leah silently felt grateful for. Meals were prepared by a private chef, a quiet, middle-aged man who said very little but cooked so well that Mila licked her plate clean at every meal. The little girl had her own pink bedroom filled with brand-new toys, a princess bed with a canopy, and a little art corner stocked with every color she had ever dreamed of having. The first week passed like a strange dream. Leah took Mila to see Dr. Helena Vance, the leading pediatric heart surgeon in Los Angeles. She was a woman of about 55, with neatly cropped silver hair, bright warm eyes, and a way of speaking that made Leah feel calm for the first time in many months. The surgery was scheduled for the following week. The cost had been paid in full, transferred directly from an account Leah didn't want to know anything about. She sat in the examination room, listening as the doctor explained the surgical procedure, and for the first time in many years, she was able to breathe fully, as though someone had lifted an enormous stone from her chest. In the second week, Leah began her self-defense lessons, exactly as she had demanded. The instructor was a woman with short hair, tightly defined muscles, and eyes as sharp as blades. Leah learned how to punch with the greatest effect, how to kick so an attacker couldn't get back up, how to recognize signs of danger before they unfolded, and most important of all, how to protect Mila in any situation. Every lesson left her body aching, but she didn't complain. This was what she needed. This was what would help her survive in the world she had stepped into. After the 5th lesson, the instructor said to read, thinking Leah couldn't hear. She learns unbelievably fast, as though she'd been waiting for this chance her entire life. One evening, after Mila had fallen sound asleep, Leah went downstairs to the kitchen for water and happened to pass by Ashton's study. The door was slightly open, and warm golden light spilled out into the hallway. She meant to walk past quickly, but something made her stop and glance through the narrow opening. Ashton was sitting alone behind the large wooden desk, not working, not reading documents. He was simply sitting there, holding an old photograph in his hand, looking at it with eyes Leah had never seen on him before. Not cold, not calculating, only sorrow, a deep and lonely sorrow, the sorrow of a man staring at something that had been lost a very long time ago. Leah stood there for 1 second, then quietly walked away without disturbing him. But that image stayed with her all through the night, like a piece that didn't fit into the picture she had already painted in her mind of this man. 2 weeks in the wolf's territory, and Leah was beginning to realize something. The wolf she had thought was the most dangerous in Las Vegas was perhaps lonelier than anyone she had ever met. But what she didn't know was that while she was trying to understand that man, her daughter had already begun slipping into the wolf's den every night. Leah Sinclair was 6 years old, and curious the way every 6-year-old child in this world is. She didn't understand why she had suddenly come to live in a castle straight out of a fairy tale, why her mother now had a new friend who was tall and frightening, and why that friend always looked at her with those eyes and then quickly looked away, as though he were afraid she might disappear if he watched too long. Her mother said his name was Ashton, and that he was her friend. But Mila knew grown-ups often lied about complicated things. She just didn't know how complicated this one really was. During those first days in the estate, Mila watched Ashton from a distance like a little kitten stalking its prey. Whenever he walked down the hallway, she hid behind a door and peeked after him, her eyes wide with curiosity. He's so tall. He stands so straight. He never smiles. Those small observations gathered in her mind like pieces of a picture not yet finished. And one night, Mila decided she would find the answer for herself. At 9 o'clock that evening, when her mother thought she was fast asleep, Mila slipped out of bed and padded barefoot downstairs, her steps as light as a cat's on the carpet. She knew where Mr. Ashton's study was because she had watched long enough to learn. When she got there, she saw the door standing slightly open and warm yellow light spilling into the hallway. Mila stood there for a moment, then curiosity won over fear. She gave the door a gentle push and stepped inside. Ashton was sitting behind the large wooden desk, not working, not looking at a computer screen. He was holding an old photograph and staring at it with a sadness Mila recognized at once. "Are you sad?" Her little voice broke the silence, and Ashton startled as though he had just been caught doing something he shouldn't have been doing. He looked at the little girl standing in the middle of the room in pink princess pajamas, her tiny bare feet resting on the carpet, and it took him a moment to find his voice again. "Why do you think that?" His voice was rougher than usual. Mila tilted her head and thought for a moment, the way children do when they're trying to explain something complicated. "Because you look like Mommy when she misses Daddy. Mommy holds Daddy's picture and looks like that. Then Mommy cries. Are you about to cry too?" Ashton didn't answer right away. He looked down at the photograph in his hand, then back at her with an expression Mila couldn't understand. "I'm missing someone who went far away." At last he spoke, his voice so soft Mila had to lean forward to hear him clearly. "Are they in heaven?" Mila asked, her amber eyes brightening. "My daddy is in heaven too. Mommy said so. Daddy flew up there because the angels needed his help." Ashton looked at her, and something in those eyes softened just a little. "Yes. My grandmother is in heaven too. Maybe she's talking to your daddy right now." Mila grew quiet for a moment, thinking that over. Then she walked over to the large leather sofa in the corner of the room and climbed up onto it, her tiny body nearly swallowed by the enormous chair. She sat there with her legs swinging because they couldn't reach the floor, and she looked at Ashton with solemn eyes. "Do you want me to draw you a picture? I'm really good at drawing. Mommy says so. You can hang it on the wall and look at it whenever you're sad. Then you won't need to cry anymore." Ashton looked at her, this 6-year-old child with amber eyes exactly like her mother's, and a face so innocent it knew nothing of the darkness around her. And for the first time in many years, he felt something stir inside his chest. "Yes, I'd like to see your drawing." From that night on, Mila began sneaking into Ashton's study every evening. She brought paper and colored pencils with her, sat on the large sofa, and made bright, colorful drawings while Ashton worked. Sometimes she told him stories about preschool, about the friends she didn't have yet, about the strange dreams she often had. Sometimes she asked the sort of questions only children would think to ask. Why is the sky blue? Why do you never smile? Why are you always by yourself? And Ashton answered every question seriously, as though he were speaking to an adult rather than a 6-year-old little girl. One night, after finishing a drawing of a large house with a garden full of flowers in every color, Mila looked up at Ashton with curious eyes. "Mr. Ashton, do you want me to be your daughter? Then you won't be lonely anymore, and I'll have 2 daddies. One daddy in heaven and one daddy here." Ashton didn't answer. He only looked at her for a very long time, and those eyes that were usually as cold as steel grew a little warmer now, like the first light of dawn touching the surface of a frozen lake. 1 week later, Leah went looking for her daughter when Mila wasn't in her room at bedtime. She walked down the hallway and stopped outside Ashton's study when she heard Mila's giggling laughter spilling through the door. She stood there, listening to Ashton's low voice, explaining something about the stars, while her daughter burst out with delighted excitement. "Mars is red, Mr. Ashton. Why is it red? Does anybody live there?" Leah stood there, not knowing what to feel. The world she had thought she understood was shifting beneath her feet, and she wasn't sure whether that was good or bad. Ashton Mercer, the most feared shadow boss in Las Vegas, was sitting there explaining Mars to a 6-year-old girl in princess pajamas. And tomorrow, Leah would sit beside her daughter's hospital bed for 8 hours, never knowing that the man would be there with her from beginning to end. Leah woke at 4 o'clock in the morning, though she wasn't even sure she had slept for a single minute the night before. She sat beside Mila's bed, watching her daughter sleep beneath the soft glow of the pale pink nightlight, and tried to memorize every detail of that little face, as though she feared she might forget it. The long curve of her lashes fluttered gently with the rhythm of her steady breathing. Her cheeks were touched with the faint pink of peach blossoms. Her soft brown hair spilled across the pillow. Her tiny fingers were wrapped tightly around the old teddy bear James had bought for her before he was gone. Leah clenched her hands into fists, fighting back her tears. Today was the day of the surgery. Today was the day that would decide whether her daughter lived or died. At 6 o'clock, Leah gently woke Mila. The little girl rubbed her eyes, let out a long yawn, then looked at her mother with sleepy amber eyes. "We're going to the hospital today, aren't we, Mommy?" Her voice was rough with sleep. Leah nodded, trying to keep her own voice steady. "Yes, sweetheart. The doctor is going to fix your heart today, and then you'll be strong and healthy, and you'll be able to run and play like the other children." Mila was quiet for a moment, as though she were thinking about something very serious. Then she looked up at her mother and nodded with a kind of determination that made Leah's heart tighten painfully. "I'll be brave, Mommy. I won't cry." At the hospital, everything moved with dizzying speed. The nurses took Mila into the prep room, dressed her in a pale blue hospital gown, and slipped anesthesia into her tiny vein. Leah held her daughter's hand until those eyes slowly drifted shut, and Mila sank into sleep. The doors to the operating room closed with a dry, final sound, and Leah stood alone in the cold white corridor, feeling as though someone had just pulled the soul straight out of her body. She walked into the waiting room, sat down on a hard plastic chair, and began to wait. Her hands were clenched so tightly that her knuckles had turned white, her nails digging deep into her palms. But she didn't feel any pain. She didn't feel anything at all except the paralyzing fear slowly swallowing her piece by piece. In the second hour, the waiting room door suddenly opened, and Leah looked up, her heart pounding with hope and terror. But it wasn't the doctor who walked in. Ashton Mercer stood in the doorway in his usual flawless black suit, his eyes sweeping across the room before settling on her. He didn't say anything. He didn't ask how she was. He didn't explain why he was there. He simply walked in, sat down 2 chairs away from her, and took out his phone to call Reed. His voice sounded low and clear in the silent room. "Cancel every meeting today. No exceptions." Leah looked at him and didn't know what to say. Didn't know what she was supposed to feel. She only knew that his presence, quiet as it was, made this cold waiting room feel a little less frightening. By the 4th hour, Leah had begun to shake. Not from the cold, but because the fear she had held inside for too long had finally found a way out through waves of trembling she couldn't control. She clasped her hands together, trying to stop her body from betraying her, but it did no good. Ashton didn't say a word. He simply stood up, removed his black suit jacket, and laid it gently over her shoulders. The warmth of it, along with the faint scent of expensive cologne, wrapped around her like an invisible blanket. Leah wanted to thank him, wanted to say something, but her throat felt strangled shut, and not a single sound would come out. In the 6th hour, everything broke apart. Leah began to cry, not with loud sobs, but with silent tears that slid down her cheeks. Unstoppable, uncontrollable. She hadn't cried in front of anyone since James died. She had kept all her pain buried inside, built a wall around her heart, and refused to let anyone see her weakness. But now, in this cold white waiting room, with her daughter lying on an operating table and that little heart being cut open and repaired, the wall collapsed completely. Ashton didn't try to comfort her. He didn't say things like "everything will be all right" or "don't worry." He simply sat there in silence, like a solid stone in the center of the storm. And strangely enough, that silence made Leah feel less alone than any words of comfort ever could have. In the 8th hour, the doors to the operating room finally opened. Dr. Helena Vance stepped out, pulling her mask down beneath her chin, and Leah rose to her feet with a heart pounding like war drums. The doctor looked at her and smiled. "The surgery is finished. Your daughter's heart has been repaired, and everything went very well. She should make a full recovery within the next few weeks." Leah heard the words as though they were coming from another world. Her legs shook so badly that she nearly fell when she tried to step forward, and a steady hand caught her by the elbow just in time. Ashton. It was the first time he had touched her since the handshake on their wedding day, and Leah didn't pull away. "Thank you," she said. her voice hoarse from too much crying. "Thank you for being here." Ashton looked at her for a long moment, then gave the faintest shake of his head. "Don't thank me. You deserve the chance to save your daughter. I just happened to be the man with enough money to make it possible." Leah looked at him. This man who had sat with her for 8 hours without asking for anything, who had canceled every meeting to stay there with her, who had given her his jacket when she trembled and sat beside her in silence while she cried. He didn't need to be there. He chose to be there. And that was the greatest difference Leah had ever seen in anyone. That night, after Mila had been moved into recovery and had fallen asleep under the lingering hold of medication, Leah came home but couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about those 8 hours in the waiting room, thinking about the warm silence of the man who had sat 2 chairs away from her. At 2 o'clock in the morning, she gave up trying to sleep and went downstairs to get some water. But as she passed through the living room, she discovered she wasn't the only one awake in that vast house. Mila recovered so quickly that even the doctors were surprised. 2 weeks after the surgery, she was already able to sit up and draw. 1 month later, she was running all over the estate garden, her bright laughter ringing through the air like the sound of wind chimes. Color returned to her little cheeks. Her eyes shone more brightly than ever, and Leah stood by the window watching her daughter chase a butterfly, feeling her heart grow lighter than it had been at any moment in the past 6 years. But at night, after Mila had fallen fast asleep, Leah still couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about too many things for her mind to stop turning. At 2 o'clock that night, she gave up trying and went downstairs to the kitchen for water. The mansion was so quiet it felt unnerving, with only the soft echo of her footsteps on the marble floor. As she passed the living room, she stopped. In the darkness, a figure sat on the sofa, gazing out at the great wall of glass where all of Las Vegas shimmered below like a carpet of light. Ashton. He hadn't turned on any lamps. He was simply sitting there in the dark like a lonely statue. "Can't you sleep either?" Leah asked, her voice breaking the silence. Ashton didn't turn, but she heard him let out a quiet sigh. "The night doesn't like me." His voice was lower than usual, carrying a weariness she had never heard from him before. Leah stood there for a moment. Then instead of going back to her room, she stepped inside and sat down in the chair across from him. The darkness covered them both like a curtain, making everything easier to say. "I hate your world," she said plainly, without circling around the truth. "My husband lost his life because of that world. Because of men like you. Because of deals made in the dark and underground operations he tried to expose." Ashton turned to look at her, his eyes dim in the darkness. "I know." His voice held no defensiveness and no excuse, only a simple acknowledgement. Leah continued, as though those words had lived too long inside her and had finally found a way out. "But you're different from what I imagined. I thought you'd be a monster. I thought you'd pretend to be a good man just to deceive me. But you didn't do that. You never pretended to be anyone except yourself, and I don't know what to think about that." Ashton was quiet for a long while. Then a strange sound rose in the dark. He laughed. A soft, rough laugh, as though he had forgotten long ago how to laugh, and was now trying to remember. It was the first time Leah had ever seen him laugh. From that night on, they began meeting in the darkness of the living room, as though it were an unspoken habit. Sometimes it was 2 o'clock in the morning, sometimes 3, but both of them knew the other would be there. They spoke about the past, about wounds that had never healed, about things they had never told another soul. Leah told him about James, about the love they had shared, about the way he proposed to her in the rain because he had been too nervous to wait until they reached the restaurant. She told him about the years of raising Mila alone, working 16 hours a day, counting every coin to buy medicine for her child. Ashton told her about his parents dying when he was only 18, about carrying an empire on his shoulders from the age of 22 before he had even learned how to live, about Preston and the betrayal he had seen long ago but hadn't wanted to believe. On the nights when his pain grew worse because of the disease slowly consuming his body, Leah went down to the kitchen and made porridge. She didn't know how to cook many things, but porridge she could make. Ashton ate every bowl without complaint, even though his private chef cooked far better than she did. She didn't ask why he ate it, and he didn't explain. Some things don't need words. In the daytime, things began to change as well. Ashton started teaching Leah about the business, not the illegal side of it, but the things that would belong to her when he was gone. Real estate, hotels, legitimate investments. Leah sat in his study, listening and asking questions, and Ashton found himself surprised by how astonishingly fast she learned. She noticed gaps in plans that even Reed had overlooked, and she asked sharp questions that made him stop and think. "Where did you learn to be this good?" he asked one day, unable to hide the note of admiration in his voice. Leah looked at him and gave a faint smile. "I didn't learn it anywhere. I observe. When you're a cleaning woman, nobody notices you. You hear everything. You see everything. People tend to underestimate invisible people like me." Ashton looked at her for a long time, his eyes holding something she couldn't read. "You're not invisible." His voice was low and slow. "You simply choose to let other people think you are. Those are two very different things." In return, Leah taught Ashton things he had never known. She pulled him into the kitchen and taught him how to make fried eggs, a simple thing this 34-year-old man had never done in his life. He burned the first egg, ruined the second, and finally produced something edible on the third try. Mila stood beside him, cheering as though he had just won an Olympic gold medal. Leah pulled him out into the garden for evening walks, and he protested for security reasons. Yet in the end, he went anyway. She made him sit and watch cartoons with Mila, and he sat there looking confused while Mila curled up beside him and explained every scene like a tiny teacher full of enthusiasm. "Mr. Ashton, that fish is named Nemo. He got lost from his daddy. Then his daddy goes looking for him all across the ocean." Ashton nodded with the gravity of a man listening to the most important financial report of his life. They began having dinner together, the three of them, around the long dining table in the room where Ashton had once always eaten alone. Mila told stories about preschool. Leah talked about the newest drawings their daughter had made, and Ashton listened with a faint smile on his lips. A real smile, not the polite one he gave business partners. And Leah realized she was smiling every time she looked at him, looking forward to the evenings in his study, the sleepless nights in the darkness of the living room. Two strangers, brought together by a cold arrangement, were now sharing darkness and loneliness, as though they had known each other all their lives. No one gave a name to what was growing between them, but it was there, quiet as breath, warm as candlelight in the middle of a winter night. And soon, another small life would confirm it in a way neither of them could have imagined. Leah knew she was pregnant before the test confirmed it. Her body had done this once before with Mila, and the familiar signs returned like an old melody she couldn't forget. Morning nausea at the smell of coffee, a strange exhaustion even when she had slept enough, and that altered feeling inside her own body that only mothers can truly understand. She sat on the bathroom floor at 5 o'clock in the morning, her back against the cold wall, holding the pregnancy test in her hand, and staring at the two red lines standing out clearly beneath the harsh fluorescent light. Her emotions churned inside her like a storm crashing into land already laid to ruin. This was the arrangement. This was the reason she was here, the most important part of the agreement she had signed, an heir in exchange for Mila's life. But why did it feel different? Why was her heart beating faster? Not with fear, but with something that felt dangerously close to hope. She placed a hand over her stomach, where a tiny life was just beginning to form. This baby was hers, and it was his too. The following morning, Leah found Ashton in his study. He was seated behind his desk, reading a thick file, a cup of coffee giving off a faint thread of steam beside him. When she stepped inside, he looked up, and his eyes moved quickly over her, as though checking whether she was all right. It was a new habit Leah had begun to notice in him over the past few weeks. "I need to tell you something." Her voice was calmer than she had expected. Ashton set the file down and waited. "I'm pregnant." The 3 words rang through the room, clear and final. Ashton fell silent. He didn't react at once, didn't leap up in joy or show alarm. He simply sat there, his eyes resting on her with something she couldn't quite read. Then he asked, his voice lower and gentler than usual. "Are you all right?" Leah blinked, caught off guard. She had prepared herself for many questions. What did the doctor say? Is the baby healthy? What do we need to do next? But not this one. Not a question about her, about how she felt, about her health. Not about the baby, not about the heir, just about her. And that made something inside the armor she had built over so many years begin to crack. "I'm all right," she answered, her voice catching slightly. "Just a little sick in the mornings." Ashton stood and walked toward her, closer than he had come at any time since the day they signed their marriage papers. He stopped 1 step away, his eyes looking down at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not cold, not calculating, only bare honesty. Thank you. His voice had gone rough. For everything you've done. For more than I deserve to receive. Leah shook her head, trying to keep herself from being swept away by the current of feeling rising between them. Don't thank me. This is only the arrangement we agreed on. Ashton looked at her for a long moment, then gave the faintest shake of his head. No, it isn't only an arrangement anymore. At least not for me. It hasn't been for a long time. 2 weeks later, they sat in the office of her obstetrician. Leah lay on the examination bed, cold gel spread over her stomach, while the ultrasound screen showed the blurred image of a tiny life slowly taking shape. The doctor smiled and announced the news. It's a boy. The baby is developing beautifully and looks very healthy. Ashton sat beside Leah, his eyes fixed on the screen as though he were afraid to miss a single detail. The face that had once made all of Las Vegas tremble with fear now softened in a strange and quiet way, like snow melting beneath the first sunlight of spring. A son, he repeated, as though testing the word on his tongue. Leah looked at him, at that expression on his face, and felt an odd ache move through her heart. Are you happy? She asked softly. Ashton turned to her, his eyes brighter than usual. I don't remember the last time I felt happy, but right now, sitting here, seeing him on that screen, he paused, as though searching for the exact words. Maybe this is what it feels like. That evening, Leah told Mila the news. The little girl was sitting in her room drawing, and when she heard that she was going to have a baby sibling, her eyes widened with surprise. A little brother or a little sister? Mommy, her voice was full of curiosity. A little brother, sweetheart, Leah answered, smoothing her daughter's hair. Mila was quiet for a moment, as though weighing something very important. Then she looked up and asked, Is Mr. Ashton happy, Mommy? Leah smiled, remembering the look on his face in the doctor's office. Yes, sweetheart, he's very happy. Mila nodded as though that was all she needed to know. Then I'm happy too. I'll teach him how to draw, and I'll tell him about the stars the way Mr. Ashton tells me. That night, Leah lay in the darkness with one hand over her stomach, where that small life was steadily growing. She stared at the ceiling and realized something that frightened her. She was beginning to care about Ashton Mercer. Not because of the arrangement, not because of the money or the safety, but because of him, because of the way he had asked if she was all right before asking about the baby, because of the way he had looked at the ultrasound screen as though he were seeing the most miraculous thing in the world, because of the way he smiled at Mila when he thought no one was watching. But somewhere out there, in the glittering darkness of Las Vegas, Preston Mercer was watching, and he had no intention of letting her keep everything she now had. Preston Mercer was 30 years old, handsome in the polished way of a rich man's son, with neatly combed brown hair, a charming smile, and blue eyes that always carried a cold calculation beneath their courteous surface. He was Ashton's younger brother, yet the two of them were like opposite sides of the same coin. While Ashton had built his empire with sweat and blood, Preston spent money as though it grew on trees. $4 million in debt to rival casinos hung over his head, and the Castellano family, Ashton's most bitter enemy, had made him an offer he couldn't refuse: betray the empire after Ashton died, and in return his debts would be erased, and a generous share of the profits would be his. Preston had signed that deal 6 months earlier, back when he believed his brother would die without an heir. But now everything had changed. The news of Leah's pregnancy reached him like a tidal wave, smashing apart every plan he had made. If the baby was born, he would lose his inheritance. The agreement with the Castellanos would collapse, and $4 million in debt would turn him into a corpse floating in the Colorado River. Preston didn't have many choices left. He didn't dare touch Leah because she was too well protected, with Reed or at least 2 bodyguards always close by. But her daughter was different. Mila went to school, to the park, and there were times when only a single bodyguard followed her, a much easier target. The plan formed in his mind like a venomous snake curling in the dark. Kidnap the child, force Leah to leave, break this marriage from the inside. No need to kill anyone, only create enough chaos for the Castellanos to make their move. That afternoon began as normally as any other. Leah took Mila out to buy school supplies for the new school year, a short trip she had made dozens of times before. One bodyguard drove the car, Leah sat in the back with Mila, and the little girl was chattering away about the new colored pens she wanted. Mommy, I want the shiny metallic ones, so I can draw stars for Mr. Ashton. Leah smiled and stroked her daughter's hair, never knowing this might be the last time she would hear that bright little voice. On the way back, the car turned onto a quiet street as usual to avoid traffic. But today the street wasn't empty. A black van was parked across the road, and before the bodyguard could react, 3 masked men rushed in from both sides. Everything happened in only a few seconds, but to Leah it stretched out like an entire century. The car window was smashed, the bodyguard was dragged outside, and the door beside Mila flew open. The instinct of a mother and every lesson from self-defense training erupted inside Leah like a furious fire. She shoved Mila down onto the floor of the car with all her strength and screamed in a voice she didn't even recognize as her own. "Get down, baby. Don't lift your head. No matter what happens, don't lift your head." Then she grabbed the pepper spray her instructor had told her always to carry and blasted it straight into the face of the first man who lunged into the car. He screamed and stumbled back, both hands flying to his eyes. The second man came at her from the other side, and Leah fought like a wild animal defending her young. She kicked, clawed, bit, using everything she had learned and everything she never knew she knew. But it was 3 against 1, and she was pregnant. A blow from behind made stars explode in her skull, and she fell onto the floor of the car as everything sank into darkness. When Leah came to, she was lying on the cold pavement. Her head throbbed like it was splitting apart, and when she tried to sit up, the world spun around her. The bodyguard lay unconscious a few yards away, his chest still rising and falling. He was alive. But when Leah looked around, when she looked into the empty car, when she saw no familiar brown hair and no amber eyes anywhere, her heart stopped. "Mila!" she screamed, her voice tearing through the air. "Mila, where are you?" "Mila." There was no answer. Only the terrifying silence of the empty street and the distant wail of ambulance sirens somewhere far away. Leah fumbled for her phone with hands shaking so violently that it took her 3 tries to unlock the screen. She called Reed, and when she heard his voice on the other end, her own voice shattered like glass hitting the floor. "They took Mila. They took my daughter. Please find her. Please." Reed didn't ask another question. He hung up and ran straight into the meeting room where Ashton sat with 3 business partners. He leaned close and whispered a few words in Ashton's ear, and what happened next froze the entire room. The face of Ashton Mercer, the man no one had ever seen lose his composure, suddenly turned colder than any winter. His eyes became shards of ice. He rose in the middle of his partner's sentence, without an apology, without an explanation, and walked out of the room as though the whole world had just stopped turning. Within 2 hours, Ashton Mercer's entire network had been activated. Every eye, every ear, every informant in the city received the same message. Find a 6-year-old girl, brown hair, amber eyes, $1 million for any information that leads to her, and the kidnappers would wish they had never been born. Leah sat in the living room of the estate, her hands still trembling without control, her eyes red but empty of tears. When Ashton walked in, she looked up at him with eyes filled with desperation and hope, tangled together. He sat down in front of her, his eyes holding hers with a resolve she had never seen in anyone before. "I will find her. I promise you that." Leah looked at him, her voice shaking. "How can you be so sure?" Ashton didn't blink. "Because I'll turn this city upside down if I have to. I'll burn everything to the ground if that's the price of bringing her home." And when Leah looked into those eyes, she knew he wasn't joking. Somewhere in the city, inside an old warehouse on the outskirts of Las Vegas, Leah Sinclair sat alone in the dark. She didn't cry because she had promised her mother she would be brave. She didn't know her mother was searching for her. She didn't know a man was ready to face death itself to bring her home. 4 hours stretched tight as a drawn wire on the verge of snapping, and at last, Reed stepped into Ashton's study with the information they had both been waiting for. "We've identified who's behind it." Reed's voice was low and grave. "It's Preston." He used cheap hired thugs from the east side of the city. One of them was foolish enough to make a call near the place where they're holding the little girl, an old warehouse on the outskirts of Vegas, about 40 minutes away by car. Ashton didn't look surprised when he heard his brother's name. Perhaps he had suspected it from the beginning. He simply rose to his feet, put on his suit jacket, and headed for the door. Reed moved to block his way. "If we storm the place, they could hurt the child before we get close enough. We need a plan." Ashton looked at Reed with gray eyes as cold as steel. "I have a plan. I'm going in alone." Reed blinked, unable to believe what he was hearing. You're gravely ill. You can't even move fast anymore. If you go in there alone, you'll die." Ashton didn't stop. "I've lived long enough. Her life is only beginning." Leah had been standing outside the study door, and she heard every word of the conversation. She rushed inside, her eyes red from crying, but her voice steady with fierce resolve. "You can't go alone. Are you out of your mind? Let me come with you." Ashton turned and looked at her, and for the first time she saw softness inside those eyes. "No. You're carrying a child. If something happens to you, who'll take care of the baby? Who'll take care of Mila if neither of us comes back?" Leah wanted to argue. She wanted to say she didn't care, that she had to be there because her daughter was alone and frightened. But she knew he was right. She clenched her hands into fists, so tightly her nails bit into her palms hard enough to almost draw blood. "Promise me." Her voice trembled. "Promise me you'll bring her home." Ashton stepped closer, closer than he had ever come before, and took her hand. It was the first time he had reached for her in a way that wasn't born of necessity. "I promise." The warehouse stood in an abandoned industrial district, surrounded by ruined buildings and empty lots, choked with wild grass. Ashton walked in alone, unarmed, wearing nothing but his black suit and those eyes, like a man walking into hell without needing a map. Reed and his team were hidden all around the place, waiting in the darkness for the signal. Inside the warehouse, the air was damp and thick with the smell of machine oil. Light from a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling fell over the scene before Ashton. Preston stood in the middle with two large hired men at his side, a triumphant smile curling across his mouth as though he held the winning card at last. And in the corner of the room, on an old chair, Mila sat with her hands tied behind her back. Her eyes were brimming with tears, but not one of them had fallen, because she had promised her mother she would be brave. The moment she saw Ashton, her eyes lit up. "Mr. Ashton," her voice was only a whisper, trembling yet full of hope. Ashton looked at her, and though his face remained hard as stone, his eyes warmed just a little. "I'm taking you home. Don't be afraid, sweetheart." Preston laughed, the sound echoing through the empty warehouse. "What a surprise. You care that much about this little girl. She isn't even your blood. She's only the daughter of the woman you bought to bear you a child." Ashton didn't look at his brother. He kept his eyes on Mila, as though Preston wasn't worthy of being looked at directly. "She's my wife's daughter. That's enough." Preston's mouth twisted with open contempt. "Your wife. She's only a doll you bought with money. Do you really think she cares about you? She's just waiting for you to die so she can take the money and disappear." At last Ashton turned to look at his brother, and his eyes were so cold the air in the warehouse seemed to freeze. "You know nothing about love, Preston. You never have, and that's why you'll always be alone." Preston bristled at his brother's calm and gave a signal to the two thugs. "End this." They lunged at Ashton, and he didn't dodge, not because he didn't want to, but because his body no longer had the strength to move the way it once had. The first blow crashed into his stomach with crushing force, and Ashton fell onto the cold concrete floor, pain blazing through the body already weakened by disease. But the instant he hit the ground was also the instant the back door of the warehouse burst open. Reed and his men flooded in like a breaking tide, and subdued the two hired thugs within a matter of minutes. Preston tried to run, but someone caught him by the collar and threw him to the ground, his face scraping across the dirty concrete. Ashton dragged himself toward Mila, every movement pierced by pain sharp as needles. But he didn't stop. With trembling hands he untied the ropes binding her, and when the last knot came loose, he asked in a voice gone rough and hoarse, "Are you hurt anywhere? Did anyone hurt you?" Mila shook her head, her eyes wet with tears. "I'm okay, Mr. Ashton, but you're hurt. You're bleeding." Ashton looked down and noticed the cut on his hand from when he had been shoved to the floor, but he shook his head. "I'm all right. What matters is that you're all right. As long as you're safe, that's enough." Mila looked at him for a moment, then suddenly threw her arms around him, her small hands wrapping around his neck, her little face buried against the shoulder of his suit jacket, now wrinkled and streaked with dust. "For the first time," she cried, and her tears soaked into his shoulder. And Ashton held her back, tightly, as though he feared that if he let go, she might vanish all over again. When the car pulled up before the gates of the estate, Leah was already there waiting. She ran forward like a woman taking flight the moment the door opened, and Mila jumped down and hurled herself into her mother's arms. "Mommy!" The little girl's clear voice rang out like bells from heaven. Leah held her daughter and cried and laughed at once, her trembling hands checking every scratch on the child's body. "Are you hurt? Are you in pain? I'm sorry, baby. I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you." Mila shook her head from within her mother's embrace. "I'm okay, Mommy. Mr. Ashton saved me. He said he'd bring me home, and he did." Leah lifted her head and saw Reed helping Ashton out of the car. His face was pale as white paper, and each step looked like an act of pure will. She walked to him and took his hand without even thinking. "Thank you. Thank you for bringing her back." Ashton looked at her, his eyes exhausted but warm. "I made you a promise." That night, while Ashton lay in the estate's private medical room with his physician close at hand, Leah sat beside his bed and held his hand. Mila was asleep in the next room, her old teddy bear clutched tightly in her arms, and Leah knew, as she looked down at her own hand wrapped around his cold one, that she had crossed a line she had never believed she would cross. Ashton's private doctor called Leah out into the hallway the following morning, his face so grave that she knew the news wouldn't be good even before he opened his mouth. The blows to his abdomen caused serious damage to organs already weakened by the disease. The doctor's voice was low and measured, as though he were trying to soften the shock. "His liver and kidneys are failing faster than we expected. Before this, I believed he had around 8 to 10 months left. But now, after what happened, I don't think he has that much time anymore. Maybe only 2 or 3 months. I'm truly sorry." Leah stood there with the feeling that someone had just pulled all the air out of the hallway. She wanted to say something, wanted to protest, wanted to shout that it wasn't fair, but her throat closed and not a single sound came out. When she returned to the room, Ashton was lying in bed with a pale face, yet those eyes were still alert, as they always were. Mila was curled up in the armchair beside his bed, sleeping deeply after a long night of refusing to leave Mr. Ashton, no matter how much her mother begged her to go back to her room. Even in sleep, she had a fistful of his suit sleeve clutched tightly in her small hand, as though she was afraid he would disappear if she let go. Leah sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at him with eyes that couldn't hide the pain inside them. "Why did you go alone?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it was full of reproach. "You knew your body wasn't strong anymore. You knew you couldn't fight. Why would you do something so foolish?" Ashton looked at her, his eyes tired but without regret. "Because no matter what, I'm going to leave anyway. She's different. She still has her whole life ahead of her." Leah wanted to cry, wanted to pound her fists against his chest, wanted to tell him she didn't want to hear words like that. But all she could bring herself to say was one thing. "Idiot." Ashton gave a faint laugh, roughened by pain. Maybe so. Leah reached for his hand on her own and held it tightly, as though she feared that if she let go, he would slip beyond her reach forever. "You don't get to leave right now. You still owe me." Ashton looked at her with quiet curiosity. "What do I owe you?" Leah swallowed hard and felt her heart begin to beat faster. "You promised you'd be here when our son is born. You're not allowed to break that promise." Ashton's eyes widened just slightly, and something in them changed. No more coldness, no more exhaustion, only a warmth and softness she had never seen in him before. A son. His voice had gone hoarse. "The doctor confirmed it last week." Leah nodded, her eyes beginning to sting. "You're going to have a son, and you have to be here to meet him." Ashton was silent for a long moment, looking at her with eyes glistening faintly. Then he smiled, a real smile, not the polite one he gave business partners. "I'll try." Leah tightened her hold on his hand. "You don't try, you do it." Mila chose that moment to wake, rubbing her eyes with sleepy little movements. She sat up and looked at Ashton with a worry far too old for a child her age. "Mr. Ashton, does it still hurt a lot?" Ashton turned to her, and his face gentled. "Just a little, sweetheart. It's all right." Mila tilted her head and thought for a moment. Then she spoke in the most serious voice a 6-year-old could manage. "Mommy always says when I get hurt, she kisses the hurt place, and it feels better. Do you want me to try? Where does it hurt?" Ashton looked at her, and Leah saw those eyes grow even wetter. "My stomach hurts." Mila nodded solemnly, as though she had just been handed a very important mission. She climbed up onto the bed, careful not to hurt him, then bent down and pressed a soft kiss against the fabric over his stomach. "There. All done, Mr. Ashton. Now it'll hurt less. Mommy says kisses have healing magic." Ashton looked at her, and Leah saw a tear slip down from his temple into the pillow. "Yes. I already feel much better. You're very good at that." That evening, after Ivana took Mila back to bed because the little girl had finally given in to sleep, Leah still remained beside Ashton's bed. The room was quiet, filled only with the steady sound of the heart monitor and the soft rhythm of his breathing. She thought he had fallen asleep, but then he moved. His hand lifted slowly, trembling, and brushed lightly against her cheek. Leah didn't pull away. She only sat there, feeling the warmth of that roughened hand against her skin. Ashton said nothing. He only looked at her in the darkness, his eyes reflecting the city lights beyond the window, and Leah understood. She understood everything he didn't say aloud. The apologies, the gratitude, and perhaps even the love he didn't dare speak. What they had, though it had begun as a cold arrangement, had now become real. Real as the heartbeat beneath her hand. Real as the small life growing inside her. Real as the fear of losing what she had only just found. And they had only a few months left to live inside it. The final months of Leah's pregnancy passed in a strange rhythm she had never imagined would one day belong to her life. Her belly grew heavier with each passing week, every step slower and more burdened. Yet she no longer felt alone in this journey. Ashton grew weaker as time moved on, forced to use a wheelchair because his legs no longer had the strength to support a body steadily wasting away. But every day, without fail, he sat beside her in the great living room, reading to Mila, talking with Leah about the future of the company, about the plans he wanted her to carry forward after he was gone. They ate breakfast together, had dinner together, watched cartoons with Mila on weekends. They lived like a real family, something neither of them had dared to dream of when they signed that cold marriage contract all those months before. That night, the pain began at 2 o'clock in the morning. Leah woke with the feeling that someone was gripping her belly with ruthless force, and she knew it was time. She called the doctor, called Reed, and within 15 minutes the whole estate was in motion like a disturbed hive. When the ambulance arrived, Ashton was already ready in his wheelchair, dressed in a suit as always, his eyes filled with determination. Reed stepped forward, his voice low with worry. "You should stay home and rest. In your condition, you can't do this." Ashton shook his head, his voice allowing no argument at all. "I promised I would be there when my son was born. I have no intention of breaking that promise." And that was the first time Leah had heard him call the baby my son, not the heir or the child from their arrangement. In the delivery room, time became blurred between waves of pain that seemed to tear through her body. Leah lay on the bed, drenched in sweat, her hands gripping the rails so hard, her knuckles turned white. And Ashton sat there in the wheelchair drawn close beside her bed, his hand wrapped tightly around hers through every contraction. He didn't offer empty words like, "You're doing great," or "It's almost over." He was simply there, silent but present, his eyes never leaving her for a single second. Every time she cried out in pain, he tightened his hold on her hand, as though he wanted to bear some part of what she was carrying. 6 hours passed. 6 hours of pain and waiting. And then at last, the baby's cry rose into the room like the most miraculous music Leah had ever heard. "It's a boy," the doctor announced, her face radiant, very healthy. The baby was cleaned, wrapped in a soft white blanket, and placed into Ashton's arms. In that moment, time seemed to stop. Ashton looked down at the tiny flushed face sleeping against him, and Leah saw something she had never thought she would witness: tears, running down the face that had once made all of Las Vegas tremble, falling from those eyes that were now softer than she had ever seen them. "He has your eyes," Ashton whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Leah smiled, exhausted but so full of happiness it almost hurt. "And he has your nose. Hopefully he also has the stubbornness of both of us." Ashton lifted his eyes to hers, and she realized it was the first time she had called him you in that way, instead of with distance and formality. When they asked for the baby's name, Ashton was silent for a moment, looking down at the small life in his arms. "Carter," he said at last, his voice carrying a trace of memory. "That was my grandfather's name. He was the only person in this family who ever loved me without asking anything in return. I want my son to carry his name." Leah nodded and placed her hand over his as he held the baby. Carter Mercer. A beautiful name. Mila was brought into the room an hour later, her eyes wide with curiosity and excitement. She ran to her mother's bedside, looked at the tiny life sleeping in the bassinet nearby, and burst out, "He's so tiny, Mommy. Smaller than my teddy bear." Leah laughed and smoothed her daughter's hair. "You'll have to teach him a lot of things. He doesn't know anything yet." Mila nodded with solemn seriousness, as though she had just been given the most important mission of her life. "I'll teach him how to draw. Then I'll tell him about the stars. Then I'll protect him from mean kids at school. I promise." Then she turned to Ashton, her eyes so innocent and sincere that the whole room seemed to stop breathing. "Daddy Ashton, are you happy?" The room went silent. Leah held her breath. Mila had just called Ashton Daddy for the first time, as naturally as though she had called him that her whole life. Ashton looked at the little girl, and his eyes filled once more with tears that day. "Yes, sweetheart." His voice was thick and rough. "Daddy is happy. Happier than I've ever been in my whole life." Mila beamed, then climbed onto the bed and curled up carefully beside her mother and newborn brother, like a little kitten who had found a warm place to belong. She tipped her face up toward her mother, her eyes shining. "So we're a real family now, right, Mommy? Not a pretend family anymore. A real one for real." Leah looked at Ashton, at Mila, at Carter sleeping peacefully in the bassinet. She looked at the clean, white hospital room, at the morning light slipping through the window, and she felt something warm spreading through the place in her chest she had once believed would stay cold forever after James was gone. "Yes, sweetheart." Her voice caught. "We really are a family now." That night, in the quiet hospital room, the four of them rested side by side. Carter slept in the bassinet. Mila lay curled on the bed beside her mother. Ashton sat in his wheelchair next to the bed, his hand holding Leah's. Two adults who had found each other in circumstances no one could have believed. Two children who would carry this story for the rest of their lives. This was a happiness none of them had ever believed they deserved. And the hourglass was still running empty, grain by grain, without mercy. 3 months after Carter was born, Ashton Mercer was still alive. The doctors couldn't explain how a body already that ravaged could keep fighting for so long. But Leah knew. He had reasons to live. He had 3 reasons waiting inside that mansion every single day. Even so, the human body can't wage war against nature forever. Ashton grew weaker with each passing day, sleeping more than he stayed awake, and the moments when he was lucid became shorter and more precious all the time. In those final days, Ashton spent his time preparing everything with the meticulous care of a man who had always been used to controlling every detail of his life. He wrote letters, 21 letters for Carter, 1 for each birthday, until the boy reached manhood. In them were words of advice, stories about the family, lessons he wanted his son to know but would never have the chance to teach with his own voice. He wrote 1 letter for Mila, about her courage, about how proud he was to have been her father even for so brief a time, about how she had taught him to love without asking for anything in return. And he wrote 1 letter for Leah, the longest and most important of all, a letter he told her to open only when she felt ready. He met with the lawyer, Clement Voss, many times, making certain every document was completed flawlessly, leaving no crack for ill-intentioned people to pry open. The estate was divided equally. Guardianship was established with absolute clarity, and everything was protected by the strongest legal provisions possible. He met with Reed in the study, the room where he had sat thousands of times before but now had to enter in a wheelchair. Protect them. His voice was frail, but his resolve was not, at any cost, no matter what happens. Reed, the man who had stood beside him for 20 years, nodded with eyes gone wet. "I promise you." During those final nights, Leah sat beside his bed every evening. She didn't read aloud anymore, because he no longer had the strength to listen. She simply held his hand, feeling the warmth slowly fading, and prayed for time to slow down even though she knew that prayer was hopeless. Mila came to visit every night before bed, climbing onto the mattress beside him and telling him about her day. "Today I made a new drawing, Daddy. It has you, Mommy, baby Carter, and me. Our whole family is standing in front of the big house. I made the sky blue because blue is your favorite color, right?" Ashton smiled, his weakened hand moving gently through her hair. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. Daddy loves it." Carter was brought to him every morning so he could look at his son, his thin fingers brushing lightly against the baby's soft cheek, as though trying to memorize every detail. The last night came without anyone knowing it was the last. Mila and Carter were asleep in their rooms, and Leah sat beside his bed as she always did, her hand wrapped tightly around his. Ashton opened his eyes suddenly, and his eyes seemed brighter than usual, as though he had gathered up all the strength he had left. "I opened the door to that arrangement because I needed an heir." His voice was rough and so weak that Leah had to lean closer to hear him. "I never thought I'd be given this. Leah tightened her hold on his hand. Given what? You, Mila, Carter, a family. Ashton looked at her, his eyes filling under the pale gold glow of the night lamp. I love you, Leah. I know it came late. There isn't enough time left to prove it. But I need you to know it. I know. Leah's voice caught in her throat. I've known for a long time. Ashton looked at her, and there was a question in his eyes he didn't dare speak aloud. And what about you? Do you feel anything for me? Leah was silent for a long while, thoughts and feelings turning through her like a storm. Then she bent down and pressed a soft kiss to his forehead, her lips touching skin already gone cool. I don't know when this began, she whispered, her voice trembling. Maybe it was the night you sat with me for 8 hours at the hospital while Mila was in surgery. Maybe it was when you went alone into that warehouse to save her from the kidnappers. Maybe it was all those nights when neither of us could sleep and we sat talking in the dark. I don't know exactly when, but I love you. I'll miss you. So much. For so long. Ashton smiled then, the most peaceful smile Leah had ever seen on that face that had once seemed carved from thorns and stone. That's enough. That's more than enough. More than I ever deserved. The next morning, the first light of dawn slipped through the curtains, painting soft streaks of gold and orange across the bedroom walls. Leah was still holding his hand, her head resting against the edge of the bed because at some point during the night, she had fallen asleep without meaning to. She woke when she felt that something was wrong. His hand in hers, cold, colder than usual, so cold that her heart seemed to stop. She lifted her head and looked at his face, peaceful, as though he were only sleeping, but his chest no longer rose and fell with breath. Ashton, she called, her voice shaking. Ashton, my love. There was no answer, only silence, and the dawn light slowly filling the room like a gentle farewell. Leah sat there holding that now lifeless hand and cried. She cried for the man who had entered her life as a cold transaction and left it as the greatest love she had ever known. She cried for the short stretch of time they had been given together. She cried for all the things that might have been if only they had been granted more time. From the next room came the sound of Carter crying, as though the baby had somehow felt that something had changed forever. Then came the hurried sound of small footsteps, and Mila appeared in the doorway, her eyes still heavy with sleep. Mommy, why are you crying? The little girl asked, her voice full of worry. Then she looked toward the bed, looked at Ashton, and though she was only 7 years old, she understood. Daddy Ashton is gone, isn't he, Mommy? Her voice trembled. He went where Daddy James is, didn't he? Yes, sweetheart. Leah opened her arms and Mila ran into them. He's gone. The two of them cried together in the dawn light, crying for the man who had gone, crying for the love that had barely begun and already been torn apart. Ashton Mercer died in the arms of the family he had never believed he would have. But the darkness hadn't released the ones he left behind. Preston Mercer was still out there, waiting in the shadows with schemes not yet finished. 1 week after Ashton's funeral, while Leah was still drowning in grief and trying to rebuild a life for her 2 children, Preston Mercer appeared like a ghost from the past. He arrived with a team of expensive lawyers, his handsome rich boy face polished as ever, though the cold calculation in his eyes hadn't changed. Even after his arrest and release on bail while awaiting trial, he filed suit in court, claiming that Ashton's will was a forgery. He accused Leah of being a fraud, a woman who had seduced his brother when the man was gravely ill and no longer of sound mind. He demanded custody of Carter, his only biological nephew, arguing that Leah was unfit to be a mother and lacked the financial means to raise the heir to the Mercer empire. Leah sat in the conference room of the law firm, while Clement Voss, the attorney Ashton had trusted for years, sat beside her with a towering stack of files spread out before him. She didn't tremble. She wasn't afraid. She felt only a cold fury boiling inside her chest, the kind of fury she had learned to master through the long months she had spent living in Ashton's world. He kidnapped my daughter. Her voice was so calm it was almost frightening. He nearly killed Ashton before his time, and now he wants to take my son too. Clement Voss smiled, a confident smile from a man who knew he was holding the winning hand. Ashton knew Preston wouldn't let go. He prepared everything, and he truly had. It was the last gift Ashton left for Leah, the final weapon he had forged in the closing days of his life, when his body had no strength left but his mind remained sharp. First, there was a video, recorded in his study in the presence of 3 independent attorneys and a notary. In the recording, Ashton read his will in his own voice, confirming that Leah Sinclair Mercer was his sole lawful heir and the trustee appointed to manage the estate until Carter reached adulthood. He declared that Preston Mercer was stripped of all inheritance rights for betraying the family and conspiring to sell the empire to its enemies. Then there were stacks of documents, gathered by Ashton's network over many months, proving that Preston had signed a secret agreement with the Castellano family to sell his full share of the Mercer empire the moment Ashton died. The evidence showed that Preston had already accepted $4 million to erase his gambling debts, in exchange for handing everything over to the enemy. And most important of all, there was proof that Preston had ordered Mila's kidnapping, including messages, recorded phone calls, and testimony from the 2 hired men who had been arrested, men now willing to betray their employer in return for lighter sentences. At the hearing, Preston sat at the defense table, his face growing paler with each new piece of evidence brought forward. Ashton's video played through the courtroom, the deep and steady voice of the dead man sounding as though judgment itself were speaking from beyond the grave. The documents detailing the deal with the Castellanos were projected onto the large screen. The testimony of the hired men was read aloud before the court. Preston's attorneys tried to push back, offering thin arguments that Ashton hadn't been of sound mind when he made the will, but the video destroyed that claim. Every word Ashton spoke was clear. Every decision had been made with care. The judge was a middle-aged woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, a woman who had seen too many inheritance battles in the course of her career. She looked at Preston with undisguised disgust. "Mr. Preston Mercer," her voice carried through the silent courtroom, "you not only betrayed your own brother by signing an agreement with his enemies, you also kidnapped a 6-year-old child in order to threaten his family, and now you stand before this court demanding custody of a nephew you aren't worthy to look upon. The court rejects every claim you have brought, and I will make certain that the sentence imposed upon you reflects the full severity of what you've done." Preston was charged with multiple crimes: child kidnapping, fraud, conspiracy to seize property, betrayal of trust. The criminal trial took place a few months later, and Preston Mercer was convicted, disappearing into the justice system like a final ghost at last driven out of the world of the living. Leah stepped out of the courthouse beneath the golden blaze of afternoon sunlight. Reed was waiting outside with Mila holding his hand, while Carter slept peacefully in the nanny's arms, knowing nothing of the battle that had just ended. Leah lifted her eyes to the clear blue sky, drew in a deep breath, and felt the weight of victory settle across her shoulders. "I won, Ashton," she whispered, her gaze turned upward as though he were watching from somewhere above. "I protected our family." She had entered this world as a desperate woman, willing to sell her soul to save her daughter. She walked out of it as a powerful woman who had reclaimed control over her own life and the lives of her children. Ashton had given her the tools. She was the one who had learned how to use them, and her story didn't end here. 12 years passed like a long dream, and Mila Sinclair was now 18 years old. The little girl who had once trembled on an operating table with a fragile heart had grown into a tall, beautiful young woman, with the same amber eyes as her mother and a radiant smile that could warm an entire room. She had just graduated from high school with outstanding honors and was preparing to enter medical school, pursuing her dream of becoming a cardiac surgeon. When people asked why she had chosen that path, she always smiled and said that a doctor had once saved her life when she was 6 years old, and she wanted to do the same for other children. Inside Mila's small wallet, there was always an old photograph, slightly wrinkled and yellowed by time. In the photograph, Ashton was holding her when she was only 6, and both of them were laughing, one rare moment captured by Reed when no one knew he was taking it. It was the most precious photograph she owned. Carter Mercer was 12 years old, and the boy was the very image of his father. Dark hair, deep gray eyes, and a calmness far beyond his years. He knew that one day he would inherit the Mercer Company, and he was already learning how to become worthy of that responsibility. Every year on his birthday, Carter received a letter from his father, the letters Ashton had written in the final days of his life, placing into them everything he wanted his son to know, but would never have the chance to say in person. This year, the 12th letter was opened with hands that trembled slightly from emotion. "My son," Ashton had written in clear, strong handwriting, "true strength isn't making others fear you. True strength is protecting those who need protection, standing up for those who can't stand up for themselves. It took me many years to understand that, but in the end, I learned it, and I learned it from your mother." Leah Mercer was 39 years old, and she had become one of the most powerful businesswomen in California. Over the past 12 years, she had completely transformed the Mercer Empire from a dark underworld operation into a fully legitimate business. Real estate, hotels, financial investments, all of it clean and transparent. The 200 people who had once worked for Ashton still had stable jobs, and many of them had risen to become senior managers in the new company. She founded the Mila Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to helping poor children receive heart surgery when their families couldn't afford it. Hundreds of children were saved every year through that foundation, and every time Leah saw a healthy child running and laughing after surgery, she thought of Mila so many years ago and of the man who had given her the chance to save her daughter. She never remarried. When magazines interviewed her and asked why a beautiful and successful woman like her had chosen to remain alone, she always smiled and answered that she had already known the love of her life, brief though it had been, but real. Today was the anniversary of Ashton's death, exactly 12 years ago. Leah closed her office and spent the entire day with her children, just as she did every year on this date. In the morning, they visited Ashton's grave, placed fresh flowers there, and sat talking to him as though he could still hear them. In the afternoon, they looked through old photographs and told one another memories from the past. In the evening, after Mila and Carter had gone to sleep, Leah sat alone in the study, the room that had once belonged to Ashton and now belonged to her. She opened the familiar drawer and took out the letter he had written 12 years earlier, the longest and most important letter he had left for her. The paper had yellowed with age, but the handwriting was still as clear as it had been on the first day. "Leah," he had written, "if you're reading this letter, it means I've gone far away. I entered this marriage as the last desperate bargain of a dying man. You turned it into a family, something I never dared dream I would have. What I truly needed, what I didn't know until I met you, was to be seen not as the terrifying Mafia boss, not as the man holding power in his hands, only as a lonely man trying to do one good thing before he died. You saw me. You were the only one who ever did. Live a happy life, Leah. Don't stay alone forever because of a dead man. But if you think of me from time to time, know that I loved you, completely, sincerely, and without a single regret. Yours forever, Ashton." Leah folded the letter and placed it back in the drawer beside the simple white gold wedding ring and the dried flower Ashton had once left on her desk one morning, without saying a word. Outside the window, Las Vegas glittered in the night like an endless carpet of light. She had built everything she now had from ashes, from a bargain with darkness, from a love that had come too late, from loss and sacrifice. She smiled, her eyes reflecting the city lights. This was enough. This was all she needed. Love doesn't have to begin with the heart. Sometimes it begins with respect, with sleepless nights shared together, with truly seeing who someone is behind the mask they wear for the world. And sometimes, the coldest bargains lead to the warmest love, when both people keep their promises. Thank you for staying and listening all the way to the end of this story. How did this story make you feel? Please leave a comment below and share what is in your heart. We would truly love to hear your thoughts and emotions. If you enjoyed this video, please press like, share it with your friends and loved ones, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss our daily videos. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.